Don't worry, May, I don't think you're in it.
I'm not worried.
Well, I'm trying to keep you happy because I'm kind of hoping someday I can, convince you to
switch, huh?
just full of joy. That's what we'll call it from now on, pulling joy. So who would like to open us up in prayer? I asked that wrong again. Who will, even if they wouldn't like to?
I will. Dear Heavenly Father, we gather here again this Wednesday night to learn and just absorb all the wonderful love and compassion and everything that you give us. We pray for all the COVID people, but especially for Colin and Doug. They're so good at everybody else, so please, Lord, take them in your arms. Thank you for all the things that you have given us. Thank you for the beautiful day. It's cold, but boy, the sun is sure pretty. We love learning from you. And we thank Dr. Andrew for having us here tonight. And it's time to go home. May everybody be safe in your arms. In Jesus' name I pray. We hope you help us. Amen.
Don't have it yet? It'd be awfully hard in that circumstance not to.
Yeah, he's not feeling good. And Colleen says she is feeling better today than she did yesterday.
Well, I had dreams of doing 2 or 3 chapters all at once. But there's a lot of material, and it would have been too difficult for me to decide which things to leave out and which things to include. So we're going to look at chapter 13 today. We're skipping 12 because 12 is it's a great piece. It's actually a song, but it's fairly easy to get a grip on. Basically, it's a song of rejoicing in salvation. And I wrote this much down on it. This is a quote from Dr. Oswald. Song is the natural expression of the spirit that is free. And no spirit is so free as the one which has discovered that its destiny is not dependent upon its striving, but rather upon the infinite power of the Almighty. You are never as free as when you realize that it's not about what you do. Your future is in the hands of God. So that's what that song is about. I'm actually thinking about turning it into a song. So if I get it done, maybe we'll learn it in church. There are 22 verses in chapter 13. Would somebody like to read? Well, you could read 10 verses and then somebody else could read 11 to 22.
Prophecy against Babylon says, Isaiah, son of Enzo, saw. Raise a banner on a bare hilltop. Shout to them. Beckon to them to enter the gates of the nobles. I have commanded those I prepared for battle. I have summoned my warriors to carry out my wrath. Those who rejoice in my time. Listen, a noise on the mountains, like that of a great multitude. Listen, an uproar among the kingdoms, like nations massing together. The Lord Almighty is mustering an army for war. They come from faraway lands, from the ends of the heavens, the Lord and the weapons of his wrath to destroy the whole country. Wail, for the day of the Lord is near. It will come like destruction from the Almighty. Because of this, all hands will go limp. Every heart will melt with fear. Terror will seize them. Pain and anguish will grip them. They will wither like a woman in labor. They will look aghast at each other, their faces aflame. See, the day of the Lord is coming, a cruel day, a blast and fierce anger, to make the land desolate and destroy the sinners within. The stars of heaven and their constellation will not show their light. The rising sun will be darkened, and the moon will not give its light. I will punish the world for its evil, the wicked for their sins. I will put an end to the arrogance of the haughty, and the humble the pride of the ruthless. I will make people scarer than pure gold, more rare than the gold of Ophir. Therefore I will make the heavens tremble, and the earth will shake from its place, at the wrath of the Lord Almighty, and the day of his burning anger. That 100 gazelles, like sheep without a shepherd, they will all return to their own people. They will flee to their native land. Whosoever is captive will be thrust through. All who are caught will be followed by the sword. Their enemies will be dashed to pieces before their eyes. The houses will be looted and their wives violated. See, I will stir up against them the Syrians, who do not care for silver and have no delight in gold. The bows will strike down the young men. They will have no mercy on infants, nor will they look for compassion on children. Babylon, the jewel of kingdoms, the pride and glory of the Babylons, will be overthrown by God, like Sodom and Gomorrah. She will never be inhabited or live in through all generations. There no nomad will pitch their tents. There no shepherds will rest their flocks. But desert creatures will live there. Jackals will fill her houses. There the owls will dwell. And there the wild goats will leap about. Hyenas will inhabit her strongholds. Jackals her luxurious palaces. Her time is at hand, and her days will not be prolonged. Well, that's kind of really hard.
What do you mean by hard?
The lilies will be dashed to pieces.
Yes, it's disturbing on a number of levels. We'll come back to that thought. The next several chapters contain pronouncements of doom upon the various nations around or near Israel. The point of these oracles seems not to be about the punishment of those nations, but rather seems to be to emphasize to God's people that God is far more powerful than the nations and utterly faithful to his people, that they are able to be saved by him, and therefore Israel should put its trust in God, not the nations, because nothing human endures. So again, it's a section, about 8 chapters long, that basically says all of these nations that you might be tempted to trust against the Assyrian onslaught, they're temporary. They're not going to stand in the end, and why would you trust in them? And the emphasis then is on what God is going to do to them, as you can plainly see from chapter 13. So it's quite possible that we will jump over a few of those because they're all basically looking at the same idea. But we also may find some interesting things in the middle of them that we want to at least spot check. But it's this chapter 13, I think, gets us going down the right track. So, what is Isaiah describing in chapter 13? Now be careful about this. What's he talking about? Paul's got a smirk on his face back there.
Well, it says the destruction of Babylon.
It says the destruction of Babylon. Where does it say that? Oh, you've got a heading there?
No.
Oh, you mean in verse 1?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Yeah, it says there that this is an oracle against Babylon.
They will be destroyed.
And that Babylon will be destroyed.
Completely.
Yeah, completely, I think is a good word, yeah. But look carefully. Because maybe you'll find some hints that there's more going on here than you first thought. What are you thinking, Paul?
I don't know if the title of the book was Revelations. I'd almost think it was something right out of Revelations.
Interesting that you say that, because I think there is a connection. Depends on what you see as the connection, whether I would agree with you or not. But yeah, I think there's something to that. Keep going. Where are you headed with that?
The end times. Or not?
I think you're on to something. What do you mean by the end times? When you say end times, what do you mean?
I mean, end times when God comes back. And this is what's going to happen?
Okay, so what then, or why are we talking about Babylon, if that's the case?
Because she's supposed to be the, let's call it, the city of cities and
The great whore.
something like in verse 9 says, the day of the Lord is coming. Well, it's going to destroy.
Yeah, and we've seen before that day of the Lord usually refers to judgment. Doesn't necessarily mean the last judgment, but it always seems to refer to some kind of outpouring of God's wrath. But what makes you think, May, that this is the end that's being spoken of?
Well, I would just say how the people of Babylon were, and it says, the Lord of heaven's armies has called this army together. They come from distant countries, from beyond the farthest horizons. They are the Lord's weapons to carry out his anger. With them he will destroy the whole land. But he's actually getting an army of people from all over.
I would say that it's not even clear that this is a human army, but it probably is, at least in Isaiah's mind. But it's interesting that he talks about to the, now I can't find it. It's where he says from the edge of the heaven or something like that. From the end of heaven. They come from a far country from the end of heaven, which is almost certainly a reference to the horizon. So, it's not like any particular nation is in mind. It's emphasizing the distance away, which suggests to me that maybe we're not even supposed to know where this army comes from, just that it is a God-appointed army.
Are they talking about the Israelites then when they said about raise a banner? And I had commanded those I prepared for battle. Listen, the Lord's on the mountain. Is he telling the Israelites that they need to prepare for this battle? Are they going to be a part of it?
I don't think so. I understand how you got there. And quite honestly, when I read it the first time through, that's probably what I would have said, especially because in the New King James it says, I have commanded my sanctified ones, my holy ones. But we have to remember that holy at its root means those that have been set apart for God. And so probably what's going on here is this is an army that God has chosen and set apart for this task. It doesn't necessarily mean that it's made up of God's people. And in fact, because of the way they execute the war, it's highly unlikely that it's God's people.
But it's not in this chapter. I thought I read somewhere where it said that the angels would be part of the army too. Somewhere.
I'm not sure where that is, but I'd love to know where. I'd love to know it.
Is there perhaps a theme here that Jesus mentions in the New Testament about lay not up yourself treasures in heaven? Because the way it's stated, it's like doing away with all physical things on the earth. You see where I'm headed?
Yes.
And establishing God's kingdom.
I think your conclusion is probably right, which is that this is part of what it takes to establish God's kingdom in fullness. Not sure about the connection with what Jesus said there. I'd have to think about that a little more.
Well, it mentions all these things that are going to be taken away, completely destroyed.
Yeah. And they're taken away from Babylon, at least at first blush, it looks like they're taken away from Babylon. It may be more about what those things connect with. Gold, for instance, is neither good nor bad. It's a neutral commodity. How you pursue it, how you acquire it, how you use it, may or may not be neutral. So maybe we're looking at removing all this stuff because of what it is associated with in a larger sense. And I don't want to jump the gun quite yet, but you may be onto something, because again, I think there is a sense in which what we see in Revelation is very similar to what we see here. In fact, John may have borrowed the imagery from right here. And when I did my dissertation on Revelation, I did not realize how much this chapter connects to it. So if I were going to do a rewrite, I would want to include more of this, because I think there is a connection. So let's dig in a little more specific way. Isaiah's been concerned with Assyria for the most part up until now, right? So why all of a sudden are we talking about Babylon? And I'll tell you right now, very, very intelligent people take this information and come up with all kinds of different solutions to it. One of the most common nowadays is to say, well, this is evidence that Isaiah of Jerusalem, the one that, penned the beginning of this, could not have written what we have here, and a lot of other stuff in here, because it seems to point toward a time about 150 or so years later than the one who wrote it. part of the reason they go there is because it's kind of a popular thing in academia to deny any possibility of predicting the future. But I don't think that here we even have to worry about it as being predicting the future. I think there's something else going on here. So why would he have chosen Babylon to suddenly make this point?
Well, like you said, Babylon was considered the city of horror. It was so bad, and
it really was not considered that way by and large. It becomes a symbol in Scripture of that kind of thing. But you're just looking at national relations at this point. International relations.
She ended up being a greater threat to...
Not at this point. Not at this point in history. At this point in history, she is subservient, essentially, to the Assyrians. In fact, she even gets spanked at one point because she tries to rebel a little bit against the Assyrians, and in concert with a couple of other groups of people, including the Medes, they go in and do a number on her.
Is Babylon a part of Assyria, though?
It would be in the empire, but it's not part of Assyria. It is another kingdom that is not too far away. They're both on the Euphrates, I think. I'd have to look at a map again, but I think it's the Euphrates.
Could it be that he was actually talking about this that would happen later?
Well, again, it could be, but it doesn't have to be, and I really don't think so. Take a look at verse 11. Joy, what did you say? I will punish the world for its evil. That kind of comes out of the blue. In the middle of an oracle that is supposedly against Babylon, suddenly we're talking about the world. It's interesting that while Babylon is not the powerhouse at this point in Israel's history, Babylon has already developed a history of its own in the Scriptures. You can go all the way back to chapter 11 in Genesis. You already have a reference to Babel or Babylon.
This is 10:10.
Oh, I guess you can go that far back, huh? But the Tower of Babel sets Babylon apart in the ancient world and begins a process that by the time you reach the New Testament, Babylon has developed a bit of a life of its own. Not a life in terms of time and reality, but a life in terms of symbolism. It becomes a symbol of all that is contrary to God and God's will. In particular, Babylon becomes a symbol of human arrogance, the kind of arrogance that is seen when human beings try to set themselves up as God in place of God. Babylon, even at this time, is a cultural center. It is not a political power, but it has great influence because of its cultural contributions, art, philosophy, those kinds of things. A little bit like France has been in recent centuries. France, with very few times in recent centuries, has not been exactly a powerhouse politically, but they continue even today to be a cultural influence. And I think that's what you have about this time with Isaiah. And already Babylon is becoming scripturally a symbol of human arrogance and rebellion against God. You would think that Isaiah would have grabbed onto Nineveh, which is one of the three capitals of Assyria. Depends on what time period you're in, whether it's the capital or not. But Nineveh is sort of the biblical way of referring to the Assyrian Empire when it just talks about a city. But Nineveh has its own symbolic character. Nineveh becomes the symbol of warfare, which makes a lot of sense, especially when you consider what I've said a number of times over and over again, which is that the Assyrians had elevated warfare to an art form. They were cruel. They were masters of military ingenuity and cruelty, and so Nineveh becomes a symbol of war itself. Babylon is a much more significant symbol, at least in terms of God and the things of God, which is why when we get to Revelation, we have that wonderful picture of fallen Babylon. Fallen is Babylon the Great. Because she comes to represent all of the evil in the world. It makes perfect sense to me that in an oracle supposedly declared against Babylon, that Isaiah would suddenly talk about the evil of the world, because they're the same critter. Symbolically, Babylon is all of the world's rebellion against God.
Because of cases here about everyone's just read. There's a space between 5 and 6. But it says here to make the earth a desolation and to destroy its sinners. I was just wondering if there was a change in the subject there or something.
You could argue that, but remember that line spacing and verse numbers and chapters are not inspired. Those are put in there for convenience so that it's easier to read when you're reading it out loud. Originally, this would have been just one continuous text. So it's somebody's opinion on where to divide things. Generally accepted, but not always held to. So while I understand where you're coming from, probably not in terms of proof. I think you have a clear connection between Babylon and what's being said about the world. So all of this violence and upheaval and revenge-sounding stuff, the forces of God, they're being depicted as coming against the entire world. The entire world, apart from God's people. For the moment, we're not talking about the punishment that's coming to God's people. In fact, it's almost as if for the moment Isaiah's done with that topic. Now he's talking about what's going to happen to all the nations round about. But it seems like by the time you're finished with it, the reason that Isaiah does this is to remind or to reinforce in the minds of Israel that if they would change their course, none of what he's been talking about in terms of their punishment is going to happen. God is sovereign over all. And he's beginning to lay that out in a very particular pattern. The nations that are considered for the next 7 or 8 chapters are all part of what would be considered the civilized world of the day. Obviously, if you're a student of history, you know that at the same time, China had a major empire as well, and you could argue that they were civilized as well. But from the scripture's point of view, this is the civilized world, because we're talking about being focused on Israel. And so what we have is God making a very clear statement, a very firm statement, that nothing you could depend on apart from God has any real strength. And there's no reason why one would want to rely on them, especially when you've got God's word on a particular subject. What is the primary charge that God levels against the world?
He wasn't the only God. There were
idolatry is mixed in there, but there's a major statement he makes, and I think it takes us back to verse 11. I will punish the world for its evil and the wicked for their iniquity. And then he makes it a little more specific. What does he say?
pride and insolence.
Pride and insolence. Yeah. So again, it comes back to why Babylon? Well, because Babylon is the symbol of human arrogance, trying to take upon ourselves what is rightfully God's.
Notice they didn't try to build a Tower of Babel again.
Well, we've already done that.
Yeah.
And if we look at that story as I think we're probably supposed to, and I'm not saying I've got the end-all be-all answer here, but I think that is a story about, or that is using a commonly seen type of religious building to make a point. The Tower of Babel is patterned after a ziggurat, which was an ancient Near Eastern temple. And what's interesting is it's like a pyramid, but it's more squared off. It's got step kind of things instead of being angled. It's got several levels, and at the top is a little house-like thing that is supposed to be where the god lives, whatever god it is you're building the temple for. And that building is actually called heaven. So you build a tower to heaven, you're building a ziggurat. But what it's supposed to be pointing out is the human beings are trying to gain control over the divine powers at work in the world, and they've completely missed the fact that the only divine power in the world is the real God. So it's the beginning of trying to take onto ourselves God's rightful place and power. The first 11 chapters of Genesis really come down to, I don't know, like a dozen different ways of saying what the garden story has said. That human beings want to be their own gods. That's the heart of rebellion. It's arrogance. It is the very definition of arrogance. And so what we have here is a reference to that basic idea, and it makes perfect sense because the Tower of Babel story is part of this description of human arrogance. Whatever else you can say about the story. So again, Babylon becomes the symbol of human arrogance and rebellion against God, just as it is in Revelation, and it is in Revelation because of all the stuff that we've been talking about. So Babylon serves to represent all human rebellion here in chapter 13. Now, let's go back to the observation that you made, Sharon. how does chapter 13 make you feel and why? And I want to hear some depth here. I don't want to just hear, yeah, the same thing. How does this make you feel and why?
Well, this was one of the things that really hung at me when I started reading the Bible, and how God would tell the Israelites, go into this town and just slaughter everything, even the animals from that there. And other than for a long, long time, why would he be that cruel? Couldn't there be somebody in that town in that there that deserves saving? And somebody told me, I don't remember what preacher it was, the reason that they slaughtered everybody, cleaned them out, was because back in those days they had all kinds of diseases and everything else, and you couldn't purify it. It's like, sad but true, you take a good person and a bad person and you put them together, and you're going to end up probably with two bad people.
I think the way that person explained it might be a little bit awkward, but the point is still the same. The ban is what you're talking about, where God puts a group of people under the ban, and Israel is supposed to destroy them. That occurs repeatedly in the conquest of the Promised Land. And the very simple reason is Israel is called to be a holy nation, a nation set apart for God. God knows that at the beginning of this journey, it's going to be hard enough with no outside influences to learn how to be God's people. If you leave the pagan occupants of the Promised Land in place, they become a very easy temptation to slip away from faithfulness to God. The early church fathers, I think, picked up on this quite clearly because they saw in the conquest a picture of the spiritual life as Christians. In fact, they used it constantly to illustrate it, that when you become a Christian, the first stages of being a Christian are very fragile. You're very fragile. And so you really need to remove as much temptation, as much of the sources of temptation as you can, in order to give you a good chance to succeed. As you become stronger in the Spirit and more deeper in your relationship with God, you can face some of those things successfully more often than not. But when you're talking about an entire population of people that are coming in fresh out of slavery with no experience at all with God other than the traveling about in the wilderness, you need to give them the best start possible. So you clean out all the temptations. It's the same reason that God says don't intermarry with the nations around you and intermingle with you. Not because he's prejudiced, not because he's racist, but because he wants to make sure that Israel does not get drawn away to idols. It goes back to that wonderful plumbing statement. It runs downhill. And you will always be dragged down. It's really hard to drag somebody up. So, when there's a negative force and you're starting out up here, it's going to pull you down. Because, gravity is already at work and everything else. So it's a way of making the best possible start for Israel. Does that justify the violence? I don't know, but I'm not God and I don't get to make those decisions. So I'll press the mystery button there. But the reason is so that Israel has a shot at becoming the people God called them to be. But if we set that piece aside and come back to chapter 13, I think you're right to feel the way you feel. Because what's being described here doesn't seem to have any reason at all, right? At least on the surface. So let's dig a little deeper. Paul, you looked like you had something you wanted to say.
I'm not so sure it's relevant.
Well, go ahead and say it.
Oh, will you repeat your original question? I think you said, how does that make you feel?
How does chapter 13 make you feel? And why?
It reassures me of my belief in God, which is that God is all powerful and He's in control of everything. In fact, quite recently I just said, it's in your hands as far as my life goes.
I wonder if that is exactly the desired impact that God and Isaiah had in terms of Israel. You think Israel was supposed to respond that way? Oh.
They should have, but they didn't.
Yeah, even said the desired effect.
Even Solomon was struck down.
Mm-hmm.
And he was supposed to have wisdom, which, wisdom is supposed to be the fear of God. And he was pulled down and even started idol worship.
Yeah. And another thing we have to remember is that if this indeed is a description of the end, what choice does a holy God have when it comes to the point of remaking creation, bringing in a new heaven and a new earth? By the way, remember, heaven does not need to be redone. New heaven means new sky. New sky and new earth, new creation. When God brings about the new creation, and the new creation is supposed to be devoid of rebellion, He's got to get rid of it somehow, right? This is a description of that. When we get to Revelation, instead of describing it in terribly violent terms, John skates right up to the edge of battle and then says, it's finished. Because God gets to speak and it's all over. There is no combat. But here, I think Isaiah is working out of Israel's experience. Oswald makes a good point when it comes to this whole chapter. He says, we American Christians get all bent out of shape when we read horrible descriptions of warfare. The rest of the world would respond like, yeah, that's war, or yeah, that's destruction, because they live it in a much more frequent and repeated way. We have been relatively insulated against that kind of violence here in our homeland. Civil War being the exception. But we're not used to this kind of stuff. The reality is when war breaks out, when you enter into war, ugly things happen. He mentioned a battle or a massacre that took place in Vietnam. And he says the reason that there was great outcry and demonstrations and all that kind of stuff over is because we've been so insulated, we really can't relate to how far warfare drags us down in terms of our inner selves. The reality is, when war hits a land, there's nobody that's safe.
And they come back not the same, too.
Oh yeah, and there's a reason for that. It's because what happens goes against our basic makeup. But I remember we were talking about World War I. I think it was when I was taking French. We were talking about how France and Belgium have been the stomping grounds for pretty much every European war, every Western European war, because it's really the only place, the only region that has flat areas. And in the days before airplanes and rockets and stuff like that, warfare took place line on line, coming up against each other. You need kind of flat space for that. If you have the high country, you've got a distinct advantage. That's why they always say, take the heights or look for the high ground. But in describing how Belgium in particular has been the stomping grounds, one of the things we were reminded of was that in World War I, when the Germans came marching across Belgium, there are actually paintings that depict this. German soldiers throwing babies up in the air and having them land on their bayonets. This is not just ancient warfare. This happens when people go to war. You lose your humanity. You lose your humanity. It ought to make you sick to your stomach. But also, that sickness ought to reinforce in you why God is opposed to warfare. Why God is opposed to violence. Why God is always seeking to reshape us after love. It's because anything less than love dehumanizes other people. And that's not what he wants. That's not what he created human beings to experience. Sin is anything that messes with relationships. Whether it's your relationship with God or relationship with other people. Obviously, warfare is a magnificent picture of everything that is wrong in human relationships. And Oswald points out that, most of the rest of the world would look at this and say, makes sense to me. Makes sense to me. But we Americans we live in a bit of a fantasy world.
My aunt told me that about my dad. He was in World War II. He was in the engineer corps where they went out first and built stuff like that. And when we have history from out there, people are asking us. The only thing my dad ever said to us about World War II was that, and I can't remember now if it was Thanksgiving or Christmas, they were going through a town, and he stopped, and the three of them found a little girl in a garbage can looking for food, and they took her with them. That's the only thing he would ever say. My aunt says, she says, your dad was the one brother that always wanted to stick up for the little guy, and he didn't want no fighting or nothing. Uncle Willie brought the hat right in there. And Uncle Howard was a bully. He says, your dad always wanted everything to be right. And then he goes off to war. But you see, no, he won't tell you.
Yeah.
And it's kind of bad too, because then you don't learn.
Well, but you have to respect the psychological damage that makes them not want to talk about it. My grandfather would tell stories from World War II, not because he was glorifying it, but maybe because of the type of job he had. He said he was able to talk about it. My uncle went to Vietnam. He won't say a word. Even one-on-one, he won't mention it at all.
My older brother's in Korea. He wouldn't mention Korea at all. Don't talk.
Yep. The only thing Uncle Bob did tell me was that he volunteered to be on point. His leaders all loved him because he was always willing to take point. And the reason for that was he'd been a Boy Scout, made Eagle Scout. He grew up in the woods. He said, I had no problem finding the booby traps. He said, I didn't want to be with the main body when the ambushes happened because they'd let the guy on point go by. They were waiting for the main unit. That's the only thing he'll tell me about.
But God hates warfare in that way. But if you look at World War I and World War II, where the Germans were the aggressors, they were literally taking over everything. Were we wrong to fight them?
I sort of tackled this one a couple of months ago. I think we have to look at this problem from two angles. The first angle is, why does a government exist? Governments exist first and foremost to provide security for their people. So it almost goes without saying that when there is a threat to a people, the government has an obligation to do something to create security. We like to think that the first step for that is diplomacy, and generally speaking, we give that at least a nominal attempt. But when you're talking about France in World War II, they got spanked. Of course they're going to defend themselves. Great Britain was under tremendous pressure. Of course they're going to defend themselves. You might be able to raise questions about the United States entrance into the European theater. Because at first blush anyway, it doesn't look like there was a direct threat. Never mind that the U-boats were all around the East Coast anyway. So they were taking out our supply ships. But I don't think there's any question about whether it was appropriate or not for the government to decide we needed to go against Japan. I do happen to think FDR used it as a slippery ploy to go help the British. But be that as it may, I think from the point of view of what government is supposed to do for its people, I don't think there was really any choice in most cases. But the question as Christians is not what should the United States have done, or what should France have done, or whoever. The question is, how should the Christian respond in that situation? And that is a different critter. There have been many Christians who have argued that going to war for one's country could be a godly decision. I have yet to figure out I've yet to find any argument that works for me on that. I think that the more Christ-like you have become, the less willing you will be to take up arms in warfare. I think it may be a subtle difference when it comes to personal protection or protecting your family. Although I think the entirely sanctified person would even be willing to sacrifice him or herself in such a situation. But what we're talking about is warfare. We're not talking about all manner of violence. And it would seem that the only argument you can make that comes out biblical all the way around is to choose not to participate in taking lives. I think Desmond Doss is a major person that we ought to have as a hero in the church, because he found a way to serve the country while maintaining his Christian beliefs. And you've got to be impressed by a guy who gets the Congressional Medal of Honor without ever having a weapon in his hands. So I don't think it's a question of denying your nation. I think it's a question of whether you're willing to participate in collective taking of lives. But ever since Constantine, was that the middle 300s, middle 400s of AD, the church has found itself in a very difficult situation, because when the Roman Empire determined that Christianity would be the national religion, now all of a sudden I'm a Christian and I'm a Roman citizen. And if the Roman Empire is Christian and it is under threat, there's a certain human response to that says, I have an obligation to protect the empire, so I must need to be able to participate in the wars that maintain the empire. So St. Augustine was the first one to attempt to explain that in terms of what we call just war theory. Just war theory is not a biblical argument. It is a logical argument that is meant to deal with the reality of being both Roman citizen and Christian. It has been revisited over the centuries, especially during the Holy Roman Empire and the Middle Ages. And we've inherited that, so that I think it's fair to say that most Christians today would hold to just war theory. In theory. However, if you take the actual criteria that just war theory puts out, and there are like seven criteria that you have to meet in order for a war to be just and therefore one that you can participate in. If you are very honest with all of those criteria, there is not a war that's ever been fought that fulfills all those criteria. So there's no such thing as a just war. None. So you end up back in the same place. You really shouldn't be participating in it.
Would you say that was what happened at Delaware in World War I?
I don't know the battle. Tell me about it.
It was Christmas.
Oh.
They had the ceasefire. So
yeah, I didn't know the name of the place.
Yeah, they started singing together, and ended up the next day they're playing football, soccer together and everything.
I think the human spirit breaks through the insanity of war in various ways, so that we can see that even our enemies are not pure evil the way we're taught to see them. But that doesn't seem to change the general outcome. I think we get glimpses of humane behavior. But when it comes right down to it, we are tribal. And if it's my tribe or your tribe, it's my tribe. And that's what ends up happening. It's sort of a related idea to the fact that, when you're dealing with actual combat, the guys in the middle of the combat are not fighting for country, and they're fighting for each other. They're fighting for the guy standing next to them on both sides. And if it's you or me or my brother, it's going to be you. It's that simple. It's a basic human characteristic. I'm not saying it's ethically right. I'm simply saying that that's part of what it means to live in a fallen world and to be part of a fallen race. But I think that when you are honest with the Scriptures and with what God's design is start to finish, I think choosing not to participate in war is the only biblical answer. But again, I'm okay if you want to try and play the just war card. I just want to see you actually fulfill the criteria before you go to war. And you won't. Never been such a critic. Never been such a critic.
How did they desensitize all of those German soldiers that were in the concentration camps where they were killing all these Jewish people? I have never been able to understand that. How they do it, what they did.
Very simple psychology. The reason Hitler rose to power is because Germany was in an economic slump to beat the band. I mean, they were in a serious depression. And they were desperate to turn the economy around. And they would grasp at anything that seemed to offer hope. Hitler came on the scene and offered them hope in the form of national pride. And he also offered at the same time a very important piece of the puzzle, which is a scapegoat. See, we need somebody to blame. And it does no good to blame World War I and the Treaty of Versailles that created the circumstances that caused the Depression in Germany. It does no good there because you have no control over that. But if I blame the Jewish people, now you got a target. You start saying things like, they control the economy. Those awful Jews are creating a system that makes all the German people suffer. They're greedy. They're unethical. We need to get rid of them. Interestingly enough, we have been known to do the same kind of thing in our own country. Those blacks. They're just parasites, and they're violent, and they have no ethics at all. One of the big PR things or propaganda things that we did in the early part of last century was to lampoon blacks as sexual deviants and insatiable, so that now, they're a threat to our women. And, all kinds of things like that. And it just creates, just by the suggestion, it builds up in the general population, first suspicion and ultimately hatred. When we can no longer control them as property, we have to find another way to see them as the enemy. We don't have concentration camps, but we have ghettos. We don't have the ovens, but we make it really hard for African Americans to get out of prison once they're in, and we make it real easy for them to get in. All of this works together. You want a scapegoat? Great, we'll make one. You know why marijuana is not legal and alcohol is? Alcohol is a white man's drink, a white man's drug. Marijuana, that's a dark person's drug. This happens in every culture. You create a common enemy, whether it's inside the population or outside the population, so that you create community cohesion. You bring the community together. It was easy to do in Germany. They were desperate. And war, I don't care how you slice it, war always saves economies. Unless you lose. And they did. And they ended up going right back in the tank. But for the time that they were fighting, everybody had a job. And everybody had purpose. It boosted morale like there was no tomorrow. Of course they're going to fight for Germany. It's the fatherland. And God's on our side, because God's always on the side of whoever's fighting. But never mind the other side saying the same thing. All you have to do is say the right things and create the right suspicions, and people will. We're sheep. There is a reason the Scripture calls us sheep. Do you understand that? There is a reason we are called sheep, because we act like them. I just want you to know, I had this plan to be done in an hour.
It didn't work.
Let me quickly ask you this question.
There's something I don't understand.
Okay.
We've talked about this numerous times, about God does not like people to be oppressed. So are we supposed to stand by? I understand the part about warfare, okay, and I'm a firm believer in the Ten Commandments. Because when I went to be Methodist, I had to go before a tribunal, and I better have known something about the Ten Commandments, because those questions were going to come up. So my point is, are we supposed to stand by and watch somebody be oppressed? And
the answer to that question is no. The answer to that question is no.
All right.
But Jesus and Paul both say, you do not defeat evil by returning evil. You defeat evil by good. The simple phraseology is, if your enemy is hungry, feed him. If your enemy is thirsty, give him a drink. If your enemy is naked, give him clothing. On a more practical level, the question becomes, what are the creative ways that I can demonstrate to the oppressor the error of their ways, and at the same time liberate the oppressed. You see, our job is not simply to free the oppressed. Our job is to offer the liberty from evil to all persons. And so Walter Wink wrote a wonderful book that you need to get your hands on. It's only about 3 inches, well, no, it's about 4 inches by 6 inches, and I think it's 130 pages long. Very easy read, but it's eye-opening. And it's called Jesus and Nonviolence, a Third Way. We've been taught from the time we were little that there are only 2 options to conflict: fight or don't fight. There is a third way. And the third way is called nonviolent resistance. You see it at work in the civil rights movement. You see it at work in the Polish uprising against the Soviet Union. You see it also in, I think it's Czechoslovakia, and a couple of the other Iron Curtain countries. You see it in South Africa. You see it in India, both under Gandhi. And what you find is that while violent insurrection can have an immediate effect, it almost always is temporary. Often because the oppressor or the oppressed become new oppressors. But the ones that have lasting peace, meaningful lasting peace, are almost always through nonviolent resistance. And that book is eye-opening. Then there are a number of other ones that he's written that kind of flesh it out, but that book in itself is tremendous.
What was the name of the book?
Jesus and Nonviolence, a Third Way. And the author is Wink, Walter Wink.
Wink?
Wink, like you wink your eye.
Okay.
That book changed my whole perspective on things.
So it's
Jesus and Nonviolence.
That's the third way.
And the author?
Walter Wink. If you type into Google or to Amazon, if you type in Walter Wink, it'll probably be the first one that pops up. If it isn't, it'll be the fourth, because the first 3 then would be his 3-volume theology based on nonviolence, which is also wonderful. But that little book is amazing. So let me ask you as we bring this to a close, what does this teach us about God? And we'll add to it, or what does it teach us about humanity? But I suspect that you're going to be more apt to find stuff about God here.
He's in control.
That God is in control. What else?
We can take vengeance on those that oppress the Jewish nation. Actually, oppress him.
Yeah, I think the larger sense of that is God is prepared to do what is necessary to rid the world of rebellion against him. Rebellion against him includes oppressing his people. But there's a very clear indication here of worldwide accountability for continuing to rebel against God. And the alternative, of course, is what's been asked of Israel all along, which is trust God. So you've got trust God or human arrogance, rebellion, that kind of thing. Anything else? What else do you learn about God?
He doesn't forget. I'll just better try to solve it.
Yeah, I think that's very much an undertone here, that God does not forget, abandon, forsake, whatever you want to say, his own people. Even when we forsake him, God is constantly there seeking ways to bring us back into the fold. Is there a cutoff point? Yeah, I think that's another thing chapter 13 does. It points out that there's a point where God has to say, okay, enough's enough. But up until that point, God does not forsake his people. Even in the midst of punishing them or correcting them, God is always for his people. So we like to say in social justice circles that God has a preferential option for the poor. In other words, God always sides with the underdog, the poor, the oppressed, and so forth. But the truth is, if that's how you word it, you're leaving out a significant piece, and that is God has a very special place in his heart for his own people. And it's possible to say that God would choose his people before the oppressed. Thankfully, his people are usually the oppressed. Except in America. We have it far better than we should. And that's why we're so lax in our faith and why the church is faltering. Because when the church is under pressure, that's when it grows. When the church has it easy, it gets lazy. And then it becomes unimportant. See, society can ignore us in America now because we have no real impact. We're not a threat to the cultural status quo. What we need is a revival so that we become, once again, a threat to the status quo. But that's going to require people boldly saying, I choose Jesus over all the crap that the world offers. And that's going to take an act of bravery, and I think a new act of the Holy Spirit. Good stuff. And you thought the gospel was not contained in Isaiah. I'm sorry, go ahead. What?
Verse 12, it says, I will make a human more scarce than fine gold, and mankind more rare than gold of Ophir.
Yeah, a lot of people are going to disappear, is what he's saying. Because human beings, generally speaking, are arrogant and in rebellion. Now, the question becomes, under the new covenant, is there a change to that prediction, or a change to that statistical reality? I think at the moment, you could still make the argument with Isaiah that far more people are hell-bound than heaven-bound. But there is a school of thought, and John Wesley seems to have been among these folks. There's a school of thought that says, in the end, more people will be saved than damned. Hard for me to see it right now, but I'd like to think maybe that's true. We'll have to see. That's in God's hands. That's in God's hands. Thank you for your patience.
We just got one thing going for us.